Our reading today is from Acts of the Apostles. It's one of the readings from the lectionary, so it's maybe a bit early in church calendar to be reading after Pentecost, but that's the reading, and it fits in well with what we want to be thinking about. So this is the reading. It's Acts chapter 2, verses 42 to 47, and this is the New Revised Standard Version. So this is Luke writing. He says, they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and fellowship, to the breaking of bread and the prayers. All came upon everyone because many wonders and signs were being done by the apostles. All who believed were together and had all things in common. They would sell their possessions and goods and distribute the proceeds to all as any had need. Day by day, as they spent much time together in the temple, they broke bread at home and ate their food with glad and generous hearts, praising God and having the goodwill of all the people. And day by day, the Lord added to their number those who were being saved. This passage is the first record of what church looked like at the very beginning. You know, sometimes our church talk is quite confusing. We confusingly talk about the early church. And of course, we mean the early church from the early days of the church. I remember at one stage when Christy and I had come into things of the Spirit, and we were talking to people about what church should look like and what the Christian life should look like. We used the term New Testament Christianity. And I remember having great confusion with some people who say, so New Testament Christianity, what about Old Testament Christianity? And it all became very confusing. But it's great that we can go back and try and see what it was like at the very start of the church. You know, it's easy for us to think that what we have experienced of church is how it always was. Most of us, and as we look around the screens, we can see that most of us grew up in a society where church was mainly about Sunday mornings and getting dressed up, going to a large building for a traditional service, sometimes described as a hymn prayer sandwich with a bit of a sermon in there. But that was what we thought about as church. And church may have included Sunday morning and Sunday evening services, and Sunday school, and perhaps a midweek Bible study and our prayer meeting or some event like that. And we sometimes find it hard to imagine that for most of the last 2,000 years, that was not what happened. Church life and practice has always changed to adapt to what was going on in society and in the world and in people's lives. And of course, that is part of the challenge in these days. Things have changed, and church needs to change to fit in with that. So let's have a look at this passage and see what happened at the very beginning of the Christian church. Our passage gives a sort of vignette of what their lives looked like in those days. There would be different ways of approaching the text, but one way would be to put it under three headings. First of all, they devoted themselves to spiritual practices. Second, they grew together as a family. And third, they spent a lot of time in the temple in the presence of God. So the text says that first of all, the church was devoted to the apostles' teaching. From the rest of the New Testament, we can see that this meant they were devoted to God's work, to right teaching or doctrine, to being taught, to growing, to maturing, and to being led by the apostles. It must have been an astonishing learning curve for everyone, but I think probably especially for the apostles. Remember, the apostles had been the disciples. They had spent 3 years listening to Jesus, watching Jesus, hearing Jesus teaching. And so they were the disciples, they were the learners, and suddenly they're the teachers. And it must have been a huge turnaround. There must have been some amazing conversations between them as they discussed what Jesus had said, what he had taught, and how they could share that with other people. They devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching. And of course, that is still important today, isn't it? Perhaps it's even more important in our days because the we live in a society which is less well grounded on the Bible than we ourselves might be. I don't know how much you watch quiz shows on television. Christy and I quite like the occasional quiz show. And we're often surprised by the answers that people give to questions about the Bible. Things that we grew up with and accept as normal, people nowadays often just do not know. And then we move on, and secondly, we see that the church was devoted to the fellowship. While verse 43 touches again on the apostles, we see in verses 44 and 45 the community described as people who have been devoted to one another, to life together, to loving and supporting and encouraging one another as the people of God, as the family of God. And that's how they developed as a people. And of course, that is still important. It's perhaps even more important in these days of pandemic. And there are lots of wonderful stories of people helping each other, of going out of their way to support, to make sure that everyone has their basic needs met. I was involved this week in making one of the veterans phone calls. We have a phone call system that phones around veterans who are perhaps on their own or lonely. And I was speaking to a lady who is just amazed and thrilled by how good her neighbour is. She's got a neighbour from heaven. And anything she needs or wants, her neighbour will go out of her way to help her. And of course, that for us as believers, that flows on from God's commandments to love, that we should love God with all of our being, that we should love our neighbours as ourselves in the second commandment. And then that new commandment that Jesus gave, that we should love our fellow believers. Remember, he said that people would know that we're followers of Jesus by how we love each other. And so that command to love and that lifestyle of loving, which we see right back at the beginning of the Christian church, is an important part of our life as Christians today and for our community and for our congregation. And then thirdly, we see the text saying that they spent a lot of time in the temple, which in many ways is really surprising when we think of what had gone on in the few weeks before, of the Easter events, of the friction between Jesus and the Jewish leaders. But here they were spending time in the temple despite all of that. And of course, what they were seeking to do was to spend time in the presence of God. And they were sort of a mindset where if you wanted to experience the presence of God, the place to go was the temple. And so daily, it says, they went to the temple to spend time in God's presence. And of course, that is still important today. And perhaps it's even more important when we're denied the freedom to go to church and when we've got extra time. Last week, somebody who couldn't join us on Zoom said that instead that they had spent time with God out walking the dog. And of course, we're learning more and more to spend time with God just where we are. We've always said in the church that the church is not the building, it's about people. You'll have heard sermons and listened to children's addresses that have told us that again and again. The church isn't about building, it's about people. The church is the people of God. Today in the news, there are stories from Germany of German churches being opened up again. And worship taking place. They've been told they can't sing because we're singing expels more fluid, and so it's more dangerous. But they're being allowed to go to church as long as they're spaced out well. And in Norway, we heard from family in Norway that their churches are allowed to open next Sunday with a maximum of 50 people and with at least a metre between each person. And so we understand that people love to meet together, and often people love their buildings, but we do know that we don't need to go to the temple to meet with God. We can meet with God day by day where we are in our homes, out on our exercise, whatever it is we're doing. So 3 interesting aspects from this passage. One of the interesting things about the passage is that when we read the Bible, often our understanding of Bible passages is maybe too powerfully shaped by the way the translators and the editors shape the text in our own particular version. And so in the version that I've been reading, these verses have got sort of brackets around them. The key word found in both verse 41 and in verse 47, and it's the word added. So in verse 41, it says, and that day about 3,000 persons were added. And then verse 47, and day by day, the Lord added to their number those who were being saved. And so that transformation of people's lives is that brackets around this story. The description of what they, the apostles, were doing is given against the background of people coming to faith. And one of the amazing things happening today is that many churches are reporting new people attending online church. People who maybe haven't been to church before, or people who haven't been seen for a long time, are being seen online or logging in and watching services online. And so something interesting is happening. So for us today, the coronavirus pandemic, of course, changes everything. The story we read in the time of the apostles, the time of Jesus' life, it must have felt very much as if God had given up on their nation. They were under occupation, their political leaders were corrupt, their spiritual leaders looked just as corrupt. But God had not finished. And Peter explained that to the people who turned out to see what all the commotion was on Pentecost. There'd been a huge turnaround. And that's not unusual for the church to experience. The people of God have often, on the one hand, experienced times of great success and prosperity, but another time, there have been times of despair and corruption where the world has cried out, "Where is your God?" The Romans mocked Jesus, and they would have mocked the Jews and their worship. But in the midst of all that was going on, we see the followers of Jesus quietly getting on with what had to be done. For they had discovered that not only was God not finished with the Jewish people, God was just beginning a new chapter in the history of his walking with his people. And we're discovering that across the land, that God is not finished with our nation. God is just beginning a new chapter in the history of him walking in this land. And that is why the church, the fellowship of believers, are exploring and finding new ways of being church. It's a new chapter of growth and spiritual prosperity. And we have the great joy and the privilege of being part of that process. And so in the meantime, we remember that the first Christians got on with things. They got on with devoting themselves to spiritual practices. They got on with growing together as a family. They got on with spending time in the presence of God. And in the midst of these new days for the church in our land and in our day, the call is the same, that we too would find ourselves devoting ourselves to spiritual practices, growing together as a family, and spending time in the presence of Almighty God.